So this is the last session of the day. Hope everybody's had a great Drupal GovCon this year. This session is DevOps for Drupal and other web applications. Basically going to go over some ways that you can improve your workflow, automate some things, and kind of get ahead of the game in terms of your development workflow for your team. My name is Jason Moore. I'm a senior systems engineer at ZivTech in Philadelphia. We're a Drupal shop, I guess you could say, but we also work with a lot of other web applications, including Node.js and things like that. You can find me online pretty much anywhere as Skills, especially on Drupal.org. And a little bit about ZivTech. We're a full-service web shop located in Center City, Philadelphia. I've been doing Drupal for about 11 years now, and been involved in many of these types of events as years have gone by. So today's session is going to go over basically ways that you can improve your DevOps workflow, or if you're not really sure what DevOps is, kind of give you an overview of how it all goes down. So we're going to go over some common DevOps goals, dev environments, workflows, and some tools you can use to kind of speed up that workflow, automation, testing, continuous integration, and sandbox testing tools that are available today. We're going to briefly go over some server config management and provisioning. This isn't Drupal config management, this is for your servers. And some monitoring, alerts, backups, and security protocols that you should probably stick to. And then hopefully at the end we'll have some time for some Q&A. There's no sessions after me, so we might be able to go over a little bit. So let's take a look first at some common DevOps goals that essentially we're all trying to achieve, hopefully, in this room. We want to avoid the conundrum of it works on my machine. It should work no matter whose machine it's on. So we want to try and standardize these tools or these environments that you're working in so that it's not a guessing game as to what this problem could be. We want to also automate repetitive tasks. We don't want to keep repeating the same code, or nobody wants to repeat the same code, so we make variables. Essentially, you want to do this in your workflow and replace things that you're repeating replace things that you were repeating in your workflows with some sort of automated process. We're going to use tests during this process to reduce errors and provide a better quality of code out of the box for our clients. Everything is in code, and everything that's in code is going to be in a version control system, so we have some sort of history as to what's going on. Back up all the things, put the little broom in your hand up in the air. Backups are very important to a successful DevOps workflow. And then we also want to document all the things. There's no sense in putting in a lot of work if you're just going to have to continue to explain it to each person individually. It's better to have a living document of some sort, or a documentation system that keeps track of these steps or ways that you go about your workflow. And basically the main goal is here that we're trying to be proactive instead of reactive to issues that may come up in your organization. So the first thing we'll look at is development environments. Some of you may already be using these. If you're not, you probably should start. So we're going to start at a local development environment, and then we'll have a varying amount of other environments depending on how complex your project may be. So we may have just a dev site, or we may have a dev site, a staging, test site, and your live and production site. Typically, sometimes there isn't always a staging and site involved, so you may just have a dev site. But typically you want to have at least a local, a dev, and your production. So you have all of these are individual environments that are isolated from each other, so you're not messing up your production site trying to test some changes out. Development environments should match production as much as possible. This means PHP versions, possibly MySQL versions, things like that, especially with Drupal 8, Composer, a lot of the dependencies are mapped to your version of PHP, so you want to make sure that you're matching this version throughout your workflow. Your local and dev environments should pretty much be disposable. If you lose your computer or something like that, that stinks, but it shouldn't take down the project. Your code should be living somewhere in a Git repository somewhere that everybody can already access. You know, you might have lost the latest database backup that you had on your local and you might need to get a new one, but you're not going to stop the development of the project by losing everything. Set up deployment workflows to deploy your code. This speeds up the process. It also reduces the amount of error or human error that you can run into when trying to go through your deployment process. So if you have some sort of a Jenkins job or something like that that you've configured to do most of this work, you know that you've already tested this out a few times, and you know that it's going to basically, as you click this button, do the things you want to deploy that code. And it may still be a manual process by clicking a button, but at least you've gone through the steps of automating most of that process. Let's take a look at the development workflow here. So everybody should know what your canonical environment is. This is the environment that is basically what comes from your live site. So you have one database. You're not ever going to really want to take the database from your development site and push that up to the canonical. The canonical should be the highest level that you're pulling down from. This reduces major issues that you can have if you're trying to take a local database and bring it up to a production website. Use Git with what's called basically Git branches into feature branches. So each feature that you're going to build becomes its own branch. It has a nice little description so that everybody knows what you're working on. And then all of that work is kind of encapsulated in one set of changes that can be reviewed easier. And I'll show some ways that we can do that later. We're also going to use a local dev tool that's standardized to some extent. So some of you may be using a virtual machine right now. We're going to talk about some Docker container-based tools here in a little bit. But basically, you want to have something that you can use as a local development environment that, like I said, should be disposable. If you want to delete it all and start from fresh, it shouldn't be a big deal to your overall project. What we want to do for the most part is try to include these kind of local development tool configs in the repository when possible. So some of these newer tools that are Docker-based basically get configured through a YAML file of some sort. You can include this YAML file directly in your repository, so anytime the next developer goes to check out the code, they can spin up their local dev environment pretty quickly, as long as you have some documentation to back up how you go about that. And then we want to set up automation where possible to be more efficient. If people aren't sure how a Git feature branch workflow goes, you essentially have a ticket of some sort that you've been assigned, and you want to create a branch in Git around that set of changes or what that feature would be named or whatnot. And then all the commits go into that feature branch that can then be reviewed and then eventually released into your either production branch or master, whatever you do. So our local dev environment, there's plenty of tools out there that you can use for this. Some people may still be using something like a MAMP or something like that, which is fine. But some of these other tools actually provide a lot more flexibility and power to your local development environment that you don't really get from using those tools. So we have, some of these might be a Vagrant VM based tool. So you have like the Drupal VM, which is a very popular project for that. Container-based tools, which I spoke about earlier briefly. These are Docker-based tools that use Docker containers on your local system versus a whole other machine, essentially. So they're usually a little bit more lightweight, at least until you start adding a ton of containers that you're running at the same time. But in general, the overall setup and configuration is a lot smaller and easier to get your team ramped up on. Then we have the package tools that I'm talking about, that I talked about, where you have MAMP or WAMP or XAMPP Some of these tools I used to use, but I don't really use them very often anymore because these other tools have so many more powerful tools built in. So, if you're using like a DDev or Lando, these have, Drush installed. They have, you can tool in or install other things inside of your container as needed, whether you need to install Redis or Solar or other services to get your site up and going on the local. You can have that all in the configuration right in your repo, which helps speed that development process up. And then you have Drupal specific tools like Acquia's Dev Desktop. They have some new one that they showed off at DrupalCon Seattle, which was, I didn't actually get in on the beta thing, so I forget what it's called, but it's a newer tool. It's more of like a web IDE of sorts that kind of brings all these things together, kind of. Or you can roll your own, whether it's with Docker or Vagrant and VirtualBox or something like that. But a lot of times that's additional overhead that for smaller teams, that's not really feasible. These other projects like DDev and Lando and Drupal VM are mature projects that are being maintained by their own teams. So it's one less thing that you have to maintain in your shop. Next, we have automation. So what are the benefits of automation? We can eliminate repetitive tasks. We can reduce human error and provide a higher quality of code on each commit. We can simplify complex tasks like deployment into maybe a single click of a button. We can run tasks when code is committed and run those tests automatically after the code is committed to like a pull request or something like that. So really, it takes, it may take some initial setup time, but it'll save you a lot of time in the end when you have these things configured properly. Next, let's take a look at some ways that you would go about testing your code. So we have the code testing, performance testing, visual regression testing, accessibility testing, and these newer tools that are kind of coming out these days that are kind of like sandbox testing tools that give you kind of a sandbox to play in with your site. So if we're going to test our code, some of you may already be doing this with some sort of PHP unit or linting your code or running bhat. These are important because you want to ensure, obviously you want to stick to these coding standards that we have. Drupal.org runs automated tests against your patches and things like that that will pass or fail essentially and let you know that you've done something wrong. You want to, ultimately the goal with these tools is to provide better code to be reviewed by your team and also a better quality of code for your customers. And some tools that are typically used for this, I have listed on this frame, are Simple Test, PHP Unit, bhat, and lint. Lint isn't really a software tool in itself. You kind of write the tool to your needs. So there's all kinds of different ones out there to do like JS and things like that. So then we have performance testing. So we have different types of performance testing that we want to look at when we're hosting websites. So we have PHP application performance, web server performance, and the website performance itself, like how are our page loads coming up. And looking at that, what do we want to solve in this PHP performance testing process? We want to identify and fix performance bottlenecks in the PHP code. We want to monitor PHP performance in real time, if we can. And we want to send alerts when specific thresholds are met. So when we're having a real big problem, we want to be able to know that as soon as possible. And some tools that we can use to do that, if some of you may be familiar with these already, are New Relic and Blackfire.io. They both kind of are very similar. You can set up an agent of sorts to watch your PHP application, and then it has a whole nice interface that you can do some analytics on the reports and get some notifications if needed. Server performance, again, we want to identify and fix any bottlenecks in the actual server performance. So now we're talking about like Apache or Nginx or what you're using to actually serve the website. And to do this, we can simulate traffic to test the sites, whether it's on a pull request basis or just in your development environment or staging environment. You can run these tests to test your code. Maybe something you've done in your code causes a huge bottleneck on the server in some way, or you have a redirect that starts redirecting weird. You can catch a lot of these things ahead of time before you have a big launch for some new feature on your site. You can run, and you want to be able to make informed decisions about your infrastructure before it's a problem. Or when you're building new servers. So a couple tools that you can use to do this would be Apache Bench, Siege, Work, HTTP Load, and JMeter. Most of those are open source tools. And depending on which tool you're using, some of them just do like an individual page, while others you can do a more robust test of like multi-threaded CPU tests and stuff like that. Next, we have testing the website itself. So it's really about these bottlenecks that we want to fix. So you could have certain pages that load fine, and there could be certain pages that load really slow. And there could be a multitude of issues going on here. A common one is not having your CSS and JavaScript being put together by the Drupal core, which can really save a lot of time on a page load just having those enabled. And so another thing that you can do while improving the performance of your website is actually improve the search engine rankings for your desktop and mobile users. Google actually keeps track of a lot of different metrics based on your page load times, and actually will add that to their algorithm of how they rank your pages. So the faster that your page loads, typically nowadays, the better ranking you're going to have. Some tools that you can use to do this. There's only a few of these that are open source. A lot of these are web-based tools. The Google PageSpeed Insights is probably the most popular one. We also have Lighthouse, which is a CLI tool that essentially is the back end to the Google PageSpeed Insights that you can run on your own system. And then another tool that I've used in the past is called Pingdom. And it's a service that runs and checks the loading of all the assets that you have coming in, whether it be files for graphics or your CSS or your JavaScript, and takes a look at all that and provides some nice reporting. Web page test is another web-based tool that you just put in the URL and it'll run a report and give you a lot of metrics on that. And then GT Metrics is a newer one that I found that I just added to the list that gives a similar kind of report on the file load times and things like that. And they provide like a generalized overview of what could be causing slowness on your site. It's not a pinpoint in a lot of cases, but it can give you a good idea of where to start looking. This one's these ones are sort of newer, I guess, at least for what we've been doing, which is a visual regression test. So these ones allow you to identify visual changes in the look and feel of your site that maybe weren't supposed to happen. So you have a baseline that you take, whether it be a screenshot or a URL that you can provide to one of these tools, and then you're basically comparing the before and after of when you changed your code to see if like the menu disappears or it went from being left aligned to right aligned or something that just doesn't look right. Certain things may be what you want it to do, but this thing will catch everything that's like, changed a little bit in the look and feel of the site, which a lot of times, these may not be caught by automated testing tools that are just testing your code, or if it's a BHAT testing functionality, that might not know that the menu moved, but you can still click the links on it. So these tools are really helpful if you're doing a lot of theming changes, or even when you're making changes to your code, something might break that you wouldn't actually catch in your tests. And this will really help reduce breaking changes in your themes and layouts, mostly. Some tools that I found that work really well for this are Wraith, Gemini, Spectre, Backstop.js, and Percy.io. Percy is one of the newer ones that I've found and has a pretty nice interface to get you up and going. I wanted to get an example done today for that, but it didn't get that far. But I have some other examples that I can show for some of this stuff later. Another newer kind of really important one for this space that we're in today is accessibility. If you're not aware, the most or all government websites should be adhering to the Section 508 compliance, which is ensuring that all people accessing your website should be able to access the content equally. There's also a lot of lawsuits going on for various organizations and institutions based on the fact that they have not adhered to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is for basically any business that's, like I think Target was one of the first ones to really get sued for it, and they didn't have alt tags on their images. Multi-million-dollar lawsuit for that. So really one of the things you want to do with accessibility testing is ensure that you do provide equal access to the content on your site for all users. You want to provide a better user experience for all your users, and you want to avoid expensive lawsuits. There's a bunch of different tools coming out of this space right now. The one I'm really liking the most right now is tenon.io. It's got an API that you can essentially send a curl command to, and the next thing you know, it spits back a full report of like W3C, standard I. You can pick which standards you want to adhere to and get a nice full report of where your site may be lacking in this department. And some other tools, if anybody's ever heard of the Wave WebAIM tool, they have an API that you can use as well. Dynolytics is a newer one that I found. It's a paid service, but it looks pretty robust. A-Checker is a tool that you can use. A nice one that you can use on the CLI side on like your local machine or wherever you do your testing is the A11Y machine. It's the accessibility machine. And it runs you basically run a command on the URL, checks the URL, and you can actually get that one to spit out a directory that generates a full HTML report that you can then like package up and send to somebody that needs to look over that stuff on your team. And then Google's Lighthouse comes back around again and actually provides a lot of these tools in its tool set as well. Another newer kind of phenomenon in our industry are these sandbox testing tools. These sandbox testing tools provide isolated environments for you to do your development and testing in. They allow you to basically configure them to be as close as possible to your live environment or your production environment. And a lot of times they allow you to quickly share the changes that you're making to others on your team to review these changes. Some of the tools that can be used to do this today are Pantheon's multi-dev setup. Platform.sh has this basically built in. Open Dev Shop is one that allows for this kind of capability. Tugboat, and a tool that we've actually built for this called Probo.ci, which I'll be showing in some of the examples later. Next topic is server configuration and provisioning. This one may not be something that everybody has to do, like if you're using Pantheon or Platform.sh or one of these other hosting platforms like Acquia. Typically, this isn't something that you would be doing so much, but if you are setting up some sort of customized hosting, you don't want to have to be going through and installing the server from scratch every time. You want to have some sort of standardized install process. So we've used some tools that make it so that our server configuration lives in code just like our website code does. And we're provisioning these servers from code. There's no actual going in and installing Nginx or whatever you're using. It's run off this provisioning software that keeps track of the changes. If there's been a change, it'll make that change wherever it needs to make it. If it's been defined on every server, it'll do it on every server. If it's been defined on one server, it'll just run on that one particular server. And we want to be able to quickly deploy changes across our whole organization or infrastructure. And this allows us to do that, just how I just said, where you can have your web server defined and provisioned through this, and allow, so if you want to make a change to your whole Nginx stack on every server, you can change it in one location and roll out this provision across every server that you want to make this change. And this can be done manually, or it can be done on a time schedule interval. And then we also want to ensure that critical configuration cannot be changed. So if there are mission critical settings that you need to have on, so you need to have some Apache module configured, or you need to have, you never want your vhost file or your Nginx config file to be changed on the production server. You can ensure that these changes, if they do get changed, are really only changed for a matter of minutes when the schedule starts to kick off again. So really those things there are pretty much what we use it for. And it saves a lot of time and effort to keep your infrastructure in sync across many different servers. So I think when I started at DivTech, we were running somewhere upwards of 35 servers off of this sort of configuration, with a handful of people being able to manage it based on how it provisions out. So just going into the provisioning a little bit more, we want to store and deploy the server code, the server config from code. We want to quickly deploy these changes when possible. Sometimes, you may need to talk to a client first before you're going to do a server reboot or something like that, but ultimately you can get the changes out there a lot quicker this way. And we're standardizing and locking down the server configuration, so there's no guessing what version of PHP all the servers are on because it's in code. And if it changes, there's a history to it. Some of the tools we've used for this or are using for this are Puppet, Ansible, CF Engine, Chef, and Docker is actually becoming more viable for this sort of setup as it matures. Another important part of your infrastructure are server monitoring and alerts. This will help you reduce the downtime of your services and servers. Again, we're going to be proactive about things. We don't want to be reactive all the time. So if we're starting to run out of memory, we want to know that ahead of time so that we can figure out what we want to do about that. Or we're running out of server space or something like that. We want to set a threshold and get a notification before it's even a problem. And we want to be able to plan for these upgrades well in advance, because you may need to get clearance for budgeting from the client or your organization, or it may be something like an end-of-life situation where you have Ubuntu's end-of-life for a certain version, or like the upcoming Drupal 7 end-of-life in 2021 or whatever it is coming up. That is the kind of thing that you want to be planning ahead for. And we want to be notified as soon as these thresholds are met. We have thresholds set up that we actually, most of the time, will get a notification through our notification system before the server host actually sends us a notification if the server goes offline or something like that. So if your server host is having an issue, server goes offline, we're typically getting notifications from our own monitoring system prior to their monitoring systems are sending things out. So if you're getting responses before the server company that's hosting you, that's usually a pretty good sign that your alerts are working pretty good. And when we talk about monitoring and alerts, we're kind of looking at three main components here. We're looking at the logging the actual alerts themselves, and we can also add some graphing tools on top to give us a better look at how we're doing these things, or how, over time, how they look. So server logging, we want to identify errors and warnings in crucial services. We want to have historical data for analysis and auditing to add and maybe to look at through our graphing tools. We want to capture important data for monitoring and alerts, for our monitoring alert system that maybe you wouldn't see otherwise. And then some tools that we've used to do this are Papertrail. Papertrail is a paid service, but it's actually really nice because it allows you to store your logs off the server. So in case there's some sort of an intrusion or something like that, somebody's not going to be able to rewrite your logs to kind of hide their steps. They're being extracted out as they're written to, and they're write only. Read only when they get to the Papertrail system, so they cannot be modified. And we want, so looking at our messaging and alerts, this is proactive approach to problems. We want to be proactive about potential problems upcoming with our infrastructure. We're going to process the log messages and monitor the thresholds, and we're going to send alerts to team members in various formats. So it could be something you're getting a Slack channel message, or you're sending out an email, or maybe you want to send somebody a text message on their phone if it's really crucial. And it really matters, depends on how you already are going about this. You can fit these tools into your workflow as it is without changing it much. So the few tools that we've used for this, Sensu, RabbitMQ, and Uchiwa. Uchiwa, again, is more of a UI for this, that you can kind of visualize the alerts. And you can silence them if you know something's broken. You don't want to silence it for too long, because then it becomes kind of, it just disappears. If you just keep it silenced for too long, you don't want to do that. So then graphing, these might be overkill for most people. This is kind of a bells and whistles for many projects, but if you really want to get a good idea of what's going on over time, it may be better to visualize it than just try and look at logs. So there's some tools that we can use to analyze data, identify these problems, and hopefully fix them by viewing this log data across your infrastructure. Some of these tools that can be used are Graphite, InfluxDB, and Grafana. Most of these are open source, and some of them are actually becoming more robust tools as they mature. So some of them actually provide overlapping functionality, even though you may want to use it for one or the other. Next, the really important thing is backups. We want to recover from catastrophic events from our backups. Maybe we want to revert to a previous state of a database if there's been some sort of attack, or we want to retrieve deleted files of some sort. Typically, these can also, your backups should also be used if you really want to know if your backup's working. A good way to do that is to actually build your development environments from backups, because you really never know if a backup is working until you've actually restored it. Just talk to MySpace about that. AutoMySQL backup is a really handy tool. It's open source. Basically, if you're familiar with like log rolls, you can actually make a rolling like daily, weekly, monthly backup schedule that will change out as you go. And then you have a really robust set of backups that you can get back to the data that you may want back. rsync can be used for fairly simple backups. And this really cool tool I found actually allows you to encrypt the backup before you send it anywhere, called duplicity. And that works with AWS and things like that if you want to tool it into something like that. Security is one of the, yes?
Just want to give you a suggestion. There's something called REST-stick. It's even better than duplicity.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll have to get that from you at the end here. One of the biggest things that we need to look at in DevOps is security. So some of the things that we can look at to try and get ahead of this are password management tools. We want to make sure we have a robust server security, and obviously since we're using Drupal, we should probably be good at Drupal security as well. So with password management, it allows us to set organization-wide requirements for passwords, whether it be length or different types of logic to how you want this to happen, whether you need to have X amount of numbers and whatnot. While this isn't a perfect thing, it does actually allow you to have a much more secure set of passwords for your servers and whatnot. We can also schedule required password resets. While this, again, isn't a surefire way to keep things secure, it does help, especially if you're requiring these on websites that are actually saved in your password management system already, because you don't really need to remember every password in this case. And it also allows you, for most of these tools, or some of them anyway, you can actually use them to share passwords remotely in a secure way, whereas you should never send your passwords through email. If you're doing it, I'm going to tell you. Next, we have to look at our server security. So we may do this by blocking ports with IP tables. We will definitely want to secure our logins with SSH authentication. And we may want to block suspicious activity that's just happening in patterns with an application called fail to ban. Fail to ban actually you can set up various checks, so to speak, that will watch your logs for different patterns that you've identified. So if you don't want somebody on your Drupal site, why should they be hitting wp-login.php? I don't know. But that shouldn't be. I mean, there's no wp-login on a Drupal site, so they're obviously trying to do something malicious. So next we need to look at Drupal security. The easiest way to be ahead of this is take a look at or enable the core update module if you don't have it enabled. It's available. If you do have it enabled, you can check these at admin/report/updates on your site. And this will give you kind of a little overview of where your security is right now on your site. You may need to update core or module. Then we have the Drupal security team puts out the Drupal security announcements. These are available at drupal.org/security. There's both announcements for Drupal core, contrib modules, and there's also a new section for PSAs that are kind of heads up to upcoming things that may happen. I know they've actually put out, the Drupal security team's not really required to, but they've actually put out some guidance in regards to additional libraries that you may have loaded on your site. I remember one time they gave a heads up about a CK editor update that should be done for security, but because it wasn't in core at the time, it wasn't really something that they needed to actually advise you on, but they wanted to give everybody a heads up. So keep an eye on the PSAs as well. They'll also send out PSAs typically if there's going to be a major Drupal core update, so like a Drupal-geddon type of situation, they'll put out a little advanced warning on that, so you set yourself aside some time that day. And you can also sign up for alerts on that same page. They have like a mailing list that you can sign up to, which you'll get an email basically as soon as they release the security advisory. I would suggest everybody get on that list if you're interested in Drupal security. And then there's a couple modules or projects that we can also use to help with that. Similar to how I was saying that we could set password requirements on LastPass, we can also set password requirements with the password policy module in Drupal. And that allows you to essentially do the same kind of thing. We can set password length requirements, character requirements, and things like that for your users. Because ultimately the weakest link in site security are usually passwords. And then we have the Drush security audit. I think it's like a plugin for Drush. I don't think it's technically a module, but you can run this tool to get like a report about various security issues on your site. If you run the Drush security audit part, it's actually part of a larger suite of tools that you can run a bunch of other checks on your site as well. So we're getting towards the end here. I know that was a somewhat unplanned intermission, but we wanted to give them a little bit of time there. I've actually done some back and forth with Hope One, and they're trying to get them ready for a Drupal 8 migration a while ago at one of the previous GovCons. So we're kind of friends, Drupal friends. So I want to get into some live examples real quick here. So we have a tool that we've developed. Let me get in the right zone here. It's called Probo. Probo.ci is the website. It's essentially a tool that you can link up to your Git repository and run a set of steps that can do a various set of things. We have a Drupal plugin that allows you to do various Drupal-related things like clear your cache after you set the site up or import your site config for a Drupal 8 site. And so essentially what you're doing here, let me go to the actual Drupal one. So currently it's all based on a pull request. So as you create branches for your feature branches, you can set up a pull request that then will go through your steps that you've created in your YAML file and build you out a site. So in this particular YAML, let me blow it up a little bit. So in this particular YAML file, I'm not making amazing amount of changes here. I basically just changed the name of this step so it would do a rebuild of this. But let me see if I can view the file. So in this particular YAML file, I'm configuring an image to use, so we have different images based on the PHP version and things like that you want to try and match your production environment with. And then you get into your steps. So this particular step here is our script plugin. It's basically anything that you can run in Bash, you can run in this plugin. So right here, I'm doing a composer create project to install Drupal 8. Doing a couple things here to clean that up, and then I'm doing a composer install step to get all my Drupal 8 dependencies. And then in this particular step, I'm actually using our Drupal plugin, which allows us to do a Drupal site install pretty quickly and set some different settings. Like if you're using this particular Drupal Composer project, it sets the actual website files in a /web directory. You can set this to whatever you want based on how you have yours set up. And then you can define what Drupal version you're using, and that changes some of the drush commands and things like that. And then you can run any additional steps that you need to or want to do other things. So at the end of this one, I'm generating a Drupal login link so that I can actually jump into the site. So if I want to take a look at this pull request, when we submit it, down at the bottom here, if anybody's used Circle CI or some of these other CI tools, we get a set of checks back. Each one of these checks is one of the steps that I defined, and you get a pass-fail basically based on the exit code for that step. And then if we wanted to let's say something happened in one of these, we want to take a closer look, you can click the details, and that'll actually bring you to the step in the Probo app where you can take a look at actually what's going on. So we can see this is all what's happening in this step. And then if all goes well, you can view the site in the end. And when this loads up, it should be our Drupal 8 website that I installed from scratch in this build. And if you take a look at the repository, the initial repository, before I did the pull request, the actual repository itself doesn't contain any Drupal code whatsoever. It's just the YAML file that I've configured. So this example is kind of specific to showing off how this works. What you would typically do is add the probo.yaml file to your repo that has your Drupal site in it, and then start testing your code within Probo like that. So this example is like very simplified. I wanted to try and make a bunch of different examples that everybody can kind of get started with and use, like maybe pull some steps out that you want to try, things like that. So if you go to Probo demos on GitHub, I made this examples project here that has I just did this the other day. So it's got basically a curated list of examples that I've created that you can test out for a few different CMS or LAMP-based CMS. We also have a couple examples for static site generators like Jekyll or Gatsby. We also have a flat file CMS, Grav. I have an example for that. And I also have some examples of how we would go about using different APIs or other testing tools to get you up and running with other tools. So this particular one I wanted to show is the Tenon one that I was describing. So this particular one is essentially a copy of the Drupal 8 one that I did earlier, although in this one, at the end, I'm adding this additional tenon.io test. Tenon.io, if you don't recall from earlier, is a an accessibility testing tool. So this curl request here will actually hit their API, and you just basically send with this. So we have a few different environment variables that you can use in your builds. So this particular environment variable here is the build domain, and the build domain is actually the URL, the view site link that we saw. That isn't known until the build is actually completed. This variable allows you to use the environment variable of that so that you can actually use that domain in your scripts when you're building your site, and you don't really know that value yet, but it'll put it in as the environment variable. So for this particular example, I'm using the build URL to then kick off an API test on this tenon.io. So if I go back, my pull request over here, I have my checks are passing. The last check I have set up for this tenon.io, I actually added a little bit of extra logic to pull out the ID that actually Tenon generates that gives me the response ID for this particular test. And then there's a response.json that you can generate, that this one is actually if you had some sort of internal tool that you wanted to use to ingest this, you can do that as well. But what I'm going to show you is the actual, did it log me out again? 1 second. I logged in earlier thinking I wouldn't have to do that. All right. So this is what the Tenon tool spits out as, no history for that test. Good. So this is one that I did earlier that was a test. And essentially you define, it has like a basic default set of like the parameters that it's going to test against, where it's like WCAG 2.0 and all these kind of things, that you can set these. I'm trying to figure out where the heck the link is here. Sorry. I didn't mirror my screens that great, so I'm trying to squint. Sorry for the hiccup. I thought I was going to be able to click on that, but apparently not. But this is the previous build that I built the other day that tested this particular URL, and it gives you the errors and warnings that you have here. I still feel like I should be able to click in somewhere else here, but I can't see where it is. But ultimately, when you set the build URL, the build domain environment variable, this is the URL that particular build would have spit out, which you wouldn't know ahead of time because it generates as the build is being created. So, but I've used this a few times to test out accessibility. It's not a surefire way to make sure that you're not going to be deked for any sort of accessibility errors on your site, but it's a good idea to get an overview of where you might need to take a look first. Is there any questions on that part of it? No? Okay. So, does anybody have any other questions on anything I covered so far? All right. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I hope everybody had a great GovCon. Sorry about the intermission there. It was sort of unplanned, but it seemed like a good message to have them come in and thank everybody from the Drupal community that's been contributing. So thank you all again. I've got some session resources I'll leave up on the screen here. Whoops, I'll try to leave up on the screen. I'll leave these up on the screen if anybody wants to take a look at some of these local dev tools. DDev is kind of the de facto standard now, I would say, at a lot of the Drupal camps and cons in the sprint rooms. Lando is another really nice tool for this. We kind of interchangeably use them depending on the project. Both of those tools really integrate well with Pantheon. So if you have a Pantheon account, an agency account of some sort, you can actually set up with a Pantheon API key to essentially run a quick command of like Lando pull or DDev pull and pull down your dev environment with the DB, the code base, and your files to really get your local up and running. Yes?
Doxel should be added to that list.
I've been meaning to add it. I'm sorry. I know I got Ted completely reminds me every time I do this that I need to add that, and I apologize ahead of time for not having that on the slide. Another one that we used to actually maintain our own virtual machine that we kind of stopped doing because all these other teams were we felt like at some point we were kind of trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit. So the Drupal VM is a really nice, if you're used to using a full-on virtual machine, I would recommend the Drupal VM for that. There's a really good documentation on that as well. That's really, really well put together. And then again, I made several demos that you can use to get started with Docker or with Probo. And if anybody wants to see other examples, I can at the end here I can show you some more stuff. But again, thank you all for coming, and have a safe trip back to where you reside.